You know, when a plane goes down in the middle of nowhere, you figure the crash itself is the worst part. But for a handful of survivors, the real terror, well, that began in the silence that came right after.
The impact was brutal, yeah? Fatal for most on board. But a few people made it through the wreck, only to come face to face with a completely different kind of enemy.
In those first few moments, there was just nothing. No engines, no radio, just this crushing, absolute silence and the horrifying realization that the world had no idea they were even gone.
I mean, think about it. Their emergency beacon was totally smashed. The search parties, they were looking for them based on a radio check from 70 miles back. They were completely, utterly alone. A whole new fight for survival was just getting started, and it wasn't going to test their strength, but their discipline.
So let's dig in. How does a totally routine flight just vanish? Well, it wasn't one single thing. It was a cascade, a chain reaction of small failures that added up to a catastrophe.
Danger loves to hide in the routine, doesn't it? This was just a standard flight, but slowly, this layer of ice started to build up on the wings. Then, the real problem. A critical sensor ices over, and suddenly it's feeding the pilots totally false information. The instruments are telling them everything's fine, but physics? Physics is telling them they're falling out of the sky. They ended up hitting a slope, not flat ground, and that, weirdly enough, is what saved them. It tore the plane apart, but it also absorbed the energy, creating this little pocket where they could survive.
Okay, so surviving the crash was a 1 in a million shot, but surviving the aftermath, that was the real test. So why couldn't anybody find them? Where was the search and rescue?
It was a total communication blackout. The locator antenna just snapped right off, so no ping ever went out to a satellite. And the search grid, like I said, it was based on that last radio check, a full 70 miles from the actual crash site. Out in that kind of wilderness, 70 miles doesn't just mean you're lost. It means you're invisible. So, faced with that reality, their first decisions were absolutely critical. And this brings us to our first paradox: the instinct you have to run versus the discipline it takes to stay put.
Just put yourself in their shoes for a second. Your first gut reaction is to get away from the mangled plane, right? To run from the thing that almost killed you. But that was the wrong move. The cold was so intense that wind exposure was the more immediate threat. They quickly figured out that the wreckage wasn't the danger anymore. It was their only hope for shelter.
And this is where the real fight started. The enemy wasn't the memory of the crash, it was the cold, right then and there. So they started tearing the plane apart, pulling out seat foam, using cargo padding, ripping out interior panels. This wasn't for comfort, it was for insulation. They weren't building a camp, they were building a shield.
All right, so they've got some basic protection from the cold. But now, other biological clocks are starting to tick, very, very loudly. Thirst and hunger. And these came with their own set of tricky, counterintuitive problems. So they're surrounded by snow, but they're dying of thirst. The paradox is that eating snow can actually kill you. It forces your body to burn precious calories just to melt it, which lowers your core temperature and brings on hypothermia even faster. The disciplined answer? It was a slow, painful process of melting small bits of snow over any residual heat they could find, like from the engine block, using pieces of metal from the wreck.
And they applied that exact same discipline to food. Look, hunger is an emotion. It screams at you, but they ignored it. Instead, they took inventory and did the math. They calculated the absolute minimum number of calories each person needed per day to just stay alive. They chose math over emotion, and that cold, hard calculation is what bought them more time.
Surviving physically is one battle, but the mental war, that's often the one that decides the winner. And for them, it meant a huge psychological shift, from just hoping for the best to actually planning for the worst.
On day 2, they're scanning the sky, expecting to be rescued. By day 4, they're getting nervous, expecting a delay. But then, around day 7, something profound happened. They stopped expecting to be found at all. And as soon as that passive hope died, it was replaced by active, long-term planning. And that one shift, it changed everything.
They went from being victims to a team. Everyone got a job. One person was on heat management, another was in charge of fuel and water, someone else took care of injuries, and another person's only job was to watch the sky for any sign of a plane. This wasn't about finding a leader, it was about creating a routine, a discipline, that would starve panic and focus every ounce of energy on survival.
Days turned into weeks. They knew they were invisible. Staying put just wasn't going to cut it anymore. So they faced the final, highest-stakes paradox of all. deciding when and how to move.
So after waiting for a clear window in the weather, 2 of the survivors set out. They were using the sun, the wind, anything they could to navigate. They pushed themselves to the brink, climbing up to a ridge they were convinced would look down on a valley, a path out.
And they got to the top and saw nothing. Just more mountains, more snow, more wilderness stretching out as far as they could see. It was a soul-crushing blow. But they didn't argue, they didn't despair, they just kept moving. In that situation, debating wastes energy. Moving preserves your odds.
And then a breakthrough. First, some animal tracks. Then they noticed a subtle change in the vegetation. And finally, they heard the distant sound of running water. They were following a very simple rule of survival. Biology leads to people. Life congregates. Following those tiny signs was their only real shot.
Eventually, that path led them to a trapper's cabin and a radio. The search grid was finally corrected. A helicopter was sent out. They were found. But let's ask the real question. Why did the rescue even have a chance to work in the first place? It worked because every single decision they made up to that point bought them more time. Sheltering in the wreck at the beginning, rationing their food from day one, working as a unit. They only made that high-risk choice to move when the math told them staying put was even riskier.
See, in the end, this isn't a story about one big heroic act. It's about a consistent, repeated process. It's about making the next right decision, the next logical choice, especially when you are terrified, freezing, and staring into nothing.
And that's the real lesson here. Rescue doesn't save you. Your decisions save you. They keep you alive long enough for rescue to finally show up and do its job. It wasn't luck that got them out of there. It was discipline.